So, yesterday as of writing this, probably a few weeks ago as I record, edit, and release this, I got blindsided by a release of Sigma Star Saga DX. Just a random trailer on the official Nintendo YouTube channel, and the game's out. Of course, it's a game that you probably don't think much about unless you are either into retro gaming, or are like me, old enough that your childhood during the aughts now is retro gaming. But it's pretty fun. The kind of 7 out of 10 we don't really get these days. It's maybe not going to be a part of your identity or have much of a legacy, but it's a pretty unique, fun experience that is at least memorable. So what does that do with why we're here? See, the reason it jumped out at me at all is that, like many games on Nintendo platforms from the aughts, it was something I remembered reading about in a Nintendo Power issue, but never playing. And that got me thinking about all of the games filed away in my memory like that. And also just in general nostalgic for the era of print magazines. So I thought I'd page through some old issues of Nintendo Power and just sort of talk about the games and columns, try and let the younger viewers know how cool gaming magazines were, and maybe you and I will rediscover some old games together. Because I've found that a lot of old games that felt like a big deal at the time kinda slipped through the cracks in retrospect. It's the big titles, your Marios, your Metal Gears, your Halos, that get remembered. But at least back then, it was really the smaller stuff that filled in the gaps and did a lot to define the experience of owning a particular console. And what better place to start than where I started? Volume 163, December of 2002. My first issue of Nintendo Power, and one that would make a huge impact on me. The cover had Metroid Fusion on it. That would probably have been the reason I picked it up for the strategy articles, and it would probably be this same Christmas that I got my GameCube, because I specifically remember that when I got my GameCube that I got it with a copy of Super Mario Sunshine, which going by some ads would have been pretty recent at this point, and Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, which is on the cover right there. Not too much to highlight on the cover other than that though, although I do want to point out, this was $5. Not bad for a magazine that was both easily an hour or two worth of reading material, and also one of the only ways at the time of keeping up with new and upcoming releases, especially if you didn't have internet access, which wouldn't have been weird in 2002. So this was absolutely worth dropping a $5 on. Open the cover to the first page, and damn it, I'm already going to start rambling. Metroid Prime was a game I wanted for so long. I played a demo of it at a kiosk in an EB Games, but wasn't allowed to actually buy a copy because, well, my parents didn't let me play T-rated games until I was 11 or 12. So Metroid Fusion was the next best thing for me, and I wouldn't play Prime itself until the Prime Trilogy release on the Wii. But here we're looking at these promotions that Nintendo used to do periodically. While I didn't get this one, of course, the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition promotion the following year made me into a Nintendo Power subscriber. And fuck, these were always great deals. This one is only $70 plus tax for a, well, they say it is a $95 value, but that's weirdly underselling it. It comes with a copy of Metroid Prime, which would have retailed for $50, a strategy guide, which, going by a later insert, would generally sell for $15, a GameCube memory card, which I don't know about the cost of, but would have been more than $0, a $10 coupon for a Wavebird wireless controller, which I'm not going to count as anything because it's just a coupon you have to spend more of your own money for. You could argue that it is worth negative money, but if I were a marketing guy, I would absolutely count it as $10 worth of value. And, of course, this comes with a 12-month subscription to Nintendo Power. I can't find another insert in this scan with a standalone subscription price. It would have likely worked out to less per issue than the newsstand price, but the newsstand price we just went over was $5 an issue, so $60 for 12 issues. And look, if I'm a marketing guy, I'm going to use that price for the estimate. It's far from the most dishonest marketing trick. So even just the game, the guide, and 12 issues of Nintendo Power come to $125, plus the memory card and the coupon. So yeah, if you wanted Metroid Prime, this was a fucking steal. There were several more bundles like this over the years, of course. As I mentioned, I got a copy of Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition with my first Nintendo Power subscription, something that really both halves of that changed my life a bit. And then I remember getting the Four Swords Adventures and Pokemon Emerald bundles. And I also remember, maybe not as fondly at the time, but kind of fondly looking back, working hard and doing extra chores over the summers to earn extra allowance to afford them. God, I'm getting old. I'm starting to get that particular flavor of nostalgia. Then there's a few pages of ads and a table of contents, but we're going to be covering everything anyway. Then we reached the Player's Pulse section, which these were always fun, where people would write in, often literal physical letters, because email was still kind of in the early consumer adoption phase at the time. I always enjoyed reading what people wrote in Nintendo Power's responses, though I only really started reading these a few years later. As a real little kid, these were boring, but as I got into my teenage years, it was actually quite interesting to me. In this one in particular, there's a fun section with people writing in about games they'd want to see on the GameCube and Game Boy Advance, and there's a surprising few that came true on here. The GameCube would indeed host Mario Soccer and baseball games, along with a Mario DDR game. There would be an Earthbound game on the GBA, though it never left Japan, so it's known as Mother 3. We would get a Pokemon game on GameCube, though the letter mentions character customization, which wouldn't be a thing in the series until much later. And to be fair, character customization wasn't a huge thing in this era of games. And someone wrote a letter that's practically targeted just at me reading this all these years later now, because they mentioned they want a Gundam game on the GameCube, though the GameCube really isn't the console for Gundam fans in the 6th generation. The PS2 was your go-to place for Gundam games. In the response, Nintendo Power does mention one coming in 2003, and I'm not sure which one that would have been. According to Wikipedia's list of Gundam video games, there were 3 Gundam titles on the GameCube. They were all Japan only, and the 2 that have more information than just the name came out in 2004. There was a GameCube version of Gundam vs. Zeta Gundam. The PS2 version came to North America, but the GameCube version did not. There's a game called Kido Senshi Gundam Senshi Tachi no Kiseki, or apparently Mobile Suit Gundam Pilot's Locus, that was Japan only. Might be a good thing to cover in a future Gundam April video. And there's an entry in the sub-series of a sub-series, SD Gundam Gachapon Wars. Anyway, moving on. Look, seeing Gundam mentioned is a great way to distract me. Maybe some other time I will investigate this. Then, get a few pieces of fan art, which, I don't know, it's just charming and cute. And, the power charts, as they call them. The best sellers, player's choice, and most wanted charts, which are cool to look at, even if I don't have a ton to say about them. It's neat seeing what people were enjoying, seeing stuff like Metroid Prime rightly topping the player's choice section, or seeing childhood favorites like Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, or that Pokemon Crystal, the first video game I ever owned, managed 12 months on the charts. Then there's the preview section, which I was never that attached to this era of the preview section. I tended to like the later eras a bit more. It's a bit rough, and honestly this issue doesn't have much I care to talk about. There's some early info on Wind Waker, but I wouldn't have cared about it for a few more months. More on that later. And then there's an interview with Yuji Naka regarding Phantasy Star Online, which I really should read, but we'll talk about PSO some more later as well. And a random page that is something that is interesting that I want to talk about is the Nintendo Online page, promoting the Metroid, Kirby, and Zelda websites, which just feels like a blast from the past to look at this. It shows this as being part of this weird transitional era where the internet was still coexisting with stuff like print magazines. The internet wasn't quite as big at the time, so they felt the need to have stuff like this to inform you that these websites existed, and show you where, if you had internet access, you could go to learn more and get more immersed in your favorite series. Not to mention showing a very different era of the internet. These days, instead of entirely separate domains like Metroid.com, you have have Metroid.Nintendo.com. And these days there's just a single page with a fairly bland modern web design feel, and it mostly exists to say, hey, here's some games or products to buy if you like these series. As compared to the much more unique web designs at the time that were a bit more playful and often had like lore tidbits and stuff. Then, very next page, we have a Metroid Fusion strategy article, which, yeah, was probably why I got this issue since it was on the cover. Fusion was the Metroid game at the time I was allowed to play and was my first Metroid game. And I did play it a lot, even if I admittedly fell out of love with it as soon as Zero Mission came out. It's kind of an oddball Metroid game with the focus on story and definitely misses some of the feeling of exploration, but I still have fond memories of it and the visuals are great. Plus it is where we started having more lore and story in Metroid games, and fuck, I just think the Metroid setting is pretty neat. Then that's followed by a Metroid Prime article, and yeah, already talked about that. Play it if you haven't, there's a remaster on Switch. It's one of the best games Nintendo has ever published. As are Primes 2 and 3, and hell, I even think Prime 4 is pretty decent even if it's not up to par. It's just unfortunate enough to be a pretty good game in a series of god-tier games. You know, there's a lot of Magic the Gathering ads in this era of Nintendo Power. I probably would have enjoyed it if I'd gotten into it, but I was pretty young, so I was more into the Pokemon TCG, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and briefly Duel Masters as a kid. Not that it mattered which TCGs I was into, because I never really had people to play with. There was zero community in my area for that stuff until I was like in my late teens and had grown out of any of that. Which is a shame too, because I was at like pretty much the perfect age that I could have caught some of the best remembered eras of Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Then we have a comic for Kirby. It's a bunch of screenshots from an episode of the anime with speech bubbles. While I don't remember this comic very much, I remember the anime and I remember really liking it as a kid. And I remember, hilariously, I found it by chance. I was sitting on the living room floor playing Nightmare in Dreamland, which I had just gotten, while my dad flipped through the TV channels, and I thought I saw something, asked him to go back, and sure enough, there was Kirby on TV. Look, we have established that the whole point of this video series is me just being really nostalgic, so expect more and more anecdotes as we go along. Then we have an ad for Jedi Knight 2 Jedi Outcast, a game which looked awesome to me at the time, but, well, T rating. I finally did play it just a few months ago, and it's pretty good. Honestly, I think it has been surpassed by Jedi Fallen Order as a Jedi experience, and the game really suffers from a rough start and a few particularly painful early levels where the primary path would be a secret in most games, along with other annoying quirks. But once you get to around Bespin and have your lightsaber and a good selection of force powers, then the game comes alive and proves to be pretty great in the end. Then we have one of a couple Animal Crossing sections in this issue, this one focusing on the e-reader cards and coming with a poster you could use to track which ones you have. You know, while I do own the original Animal Crossing, I wouldn't get it until 2004 or 2005 as a Christmas gift, and I don't remember ever asking for it or having even really remembered anything about it until I got it. I don't know why my parents got me the game. I even went and asked my mom about it, and she has no idea, but I'm glad since I would enjoy the series. Then there's a strategy article for Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, which, as mentioned before, was along with Mario Sunshine, one of my first two GameCube games. The early Harry Potter movie games were pretty amazing as a kid, giving you pretty much the fantasy of going to Hogwarts that any kid growing up with the series had, although I do remember this one had some annoying stealth bits. Those are something you don't really see brought up about the early aughts too much. Along with escort missions, mandatory stealth sections were an annoying plague on video games, presumably because people saw that Metal Gear Solid was popular and thought to just cram in some stealth sections without doing any of the work to make stealth fun. But anyway, that's kind of all I have to say. I never really got far in this game, and I don't know, I stopped caring much about Harry Potter after the last movie. Then there's a section on the GBA version of the game, which I didn't have this one, although I did have the GBA game for the third movie/book. Kind of interesting how they took things in a totally different direction and made turn-based RPGs. Also, there was a Game Boy Color version too, which honestly feels weird to think that there were still new Game Boy Color games coming out in 2002. Skipping forward, there's a hallmark of early aughts game magazines, the cheat codes, unlocks, and secrets section. Nothing here that really means anything to me though, besides Animal Crossing stuff, but these sections were always interesting even for games you didn't have. Some magazines even focus primarily on this stuff. Oh, and quickly jumping back, more Phantasy Star Online, this time the ad. We'll get to it. Then there's a K-Mart ad, which honestly mostly jumps out at me just for showing some prices, which is kind of interesting. If I were the kind of person to go for the easy, popular thing to say, I'd go, hey, look at how much cheaper games used to be. But, the main thing that jumps out at me is how much cheaper gaming hardware used to be. The GameCube, unlike many of Nintendo's later systems, was not really underpowered, although its choice of media did limit it somewhat. Although its choice of mini DVDs did limit it somewhat, but it is $150, which is unthinkably cheap by the standards of modern gaming consoles. Hell, GameCube controllers were $20, making them way more affordable if you needed some for friends. Honestly, compared to how hardware prices have increased, game prices have not increased nearly as much. I do honestly feel like complaints about game prices miss the forest for the trees, because game prices tend to be very fixed. Big budget games didn't rise $1 or $2 a year from $50 to the current $70 or $80, they went up a couple of times in $10 spikes, which is much more noticeable. Look, I love some good rage against the corporations, but, it's best to focus your ire where it belongs. The problem isn't really the luxury goods, whose prices are increasing slower than inflation. The problem is the necessities, whose prices are rising faster than inflation, while your income rises slower than inflation, leaving you with little slack left to absorb the increasing costs of video games. To put it another way, and to give some numbers to be more concrete, if your grocery prices had gone up $1 a week less, even if you're much less likely to notice a single dollar on your weekly food costs, that $1 a week would be enough to offset a $10 price increase for 5 games a year. And of course, you won't die if you can't afford new video games. I guess the game price discourse bugs me because I'm also just kind of sick of the discourse demanding games to be this or that. Taken in totality, it feels like people want games to be bigger and better, to conform to modern standards simply because they're modern and not necessarily because they're an improvement for a given game, while also not ever increasing in price for the consumer even as development costs rise higher and higher. Meanwhile, I'm as out of touch as ever. I'd be happy if games were more like they were back in this era, and heck, maybe then we could also see some dev costs and consumer prices go down instead of up. Anyway, that was a much heavier and more political discussion than I would have liked. Moving on to something more nostalgic and happy. Fundamentals. A section that always had me curious as a kid. A section tying into a game development education program that DigiPen had. They always advertised a lot of Nintendo Power. I was always interested in this and other opportunities to learn to make games when I was younger, but never did. Maybe I was too young for this at the time, but there were no programs to learn these kinds of things anywhere near me. And one time as a teenager I bought a book to try and learn to make games, but the book wasn't very good, and also it included code that you were supposed to just transcribe into the computer that didn't fucking work. I really should just buckle down and learn a game engine sometime. I've always found that a much more daunting thing to learn compared to, say, making these YouTube videos where I was able to start at basically no skill and over the years work all the way up to being mediocre. It'd be a long road, but maybe someday I could even build my dream PSO spiritual successor. Then there's a strategy section for the Star Wars The Clone Wars game, which wouldn't have been allowed to play this because of T rating, and I don't even remember this section interesting me much. I mean, honestly, Episode 2 is the Star Wars movie I remember the least about experiencing. I watched the original trilogy with my dad when I was real little, basically some of my earliest memories. I remember watching Episode 1 on VHS and Episode 3 in theaters, but I don't remember when or where I first saw Episode 2 at all. It just made no impression on me. There's an ad for Harmony of Dissonance. Wouldn't get to play it at the time, usual reason, but when the Castlevania GBA collection came out a few years back, this might have honestly been my favorite. Ad for Sonic Mega Collection, sports games that I don't care about. Then we have a bit more Animal Crossing stuff. The Crossing Guardian, a monthly column written kind of like a in-universe newspaper with some seasonal tips. These were really cute, and it's a shame by the time I got the game it wasn't as relevant anymore and we didn't have these articles. Here's some early engagement bait. Let me know in the comments below what it was like if you played Animal Crossing when it was new and followed these sorts of things. Must have been a nice little extra thing to immerse you in the life sim of it all. Then we have a bit of early news about Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. I always forget this was in this issue, but I must have been really excited about it because Pokemon was really big for me as a kid, as it was for all kids back then, and still today. As I mentioned earlier, Pokemon Crystal was my first video game that I owned, so Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire were my first new Pokemon games, and Gen 3 would ultimately be the ones I am most nostalgic for. There's an article on Robotech Battlecry, which is another game that stuck in my mind long before I ever ended up the massive mecha nerd that I am today. I get to play the Xbox version at a youth center like 10 years later, and it was pretty good. Had some rough levels, as was sadly not uncommon with games of this era, and there were some bits that were occasionally just brutal. But for Robotech and Macross fans, it's worth a go, I think. Y'all don't have nearly as many games as Gundam fans do, and especially at the time, this would have been a nice treat. Then we have Epic Center, one of my favorite sections, which is weird because I wasn't even really into RPGs until much later. As a kid, this was kind of the awesome-looking games that I didn't play section, including many years later a section on Sigma Star Saga, which is the reason I remembered it when the DX release came out. I don't know why I almost never got any of the games in this section. So many of them looked cool to me, but I just took a while to get into RPGs that aren't Pokemon, I guess. Right before this section is a 2-page spread ad for Evolution Worlds, apparently a port of 2 Dreamcast RPGs, but it's not well regarded because it chops down the first game a bit. Other creators have done videos on those if you want to look into them. I just watched one a couple weeks ago. Maybe I'll put a link to that in the card. There's preview bits on Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, a hack-and-slash spin-off that is, to my knowledge, pretty tenuously connected to the classic CRPGs that recently got their 3rd entry. And then there's another preview for Skies of Arcadia Legends, one of the best-remembered GameCube RPGs, and a port of probably the best-remembered Dreamcast RPG. I played it, and honestly didn't really see what was so special about it. Don't get me wrong, it's a good game. I do like JRPGs, and I will say I do love the setting, but actually playing it felt pretty standard, and I never did finish it. Probably should, since I did have fun, but when it comes to Dreamcast RPGs, I would pick Grandia 2 over this one any day. There's also a strategy article on Lunar Legend, a series I sometimes hear about but have never tried. Maybe I should give that recent remake of the first 2 games, I think it was the first 2 games, a go. A friend of mine does speak fondly of the PS1 era Lunar titles. But the big Epic Center feature here that we will be of course covering is Phantasy Star Online. Funny, isn't it, that a game that would become so important to me many years later was right here from the start. I've told this story before, but I'll tell it again because this is the nostalgia video. I saw this article at a time when I read this issue over and over. It always fascinated me and stuck in my head, even though I never got to play it when it was relevant. Many years later, when Phantasy Star Zero was announced and was on the front cover of a Nintendo Power issue, I somehow immediately recognized it as being that sci-fi game I saw in those older issues. I would get really excited, get that game later that year, and well, the rest is history. I have an 8-hour series of videos on the entire franchise, and I love this original Phantasy Star Online the most of all of them. But the PSO article is 5 pages of exactly enough information to get your imagination going. One page explaining how it's basically 2 games in one, and that it has online play. Keep in mind this was 2002. The idea of playing a video game online with other people was revolutionary at this time. Then there's one page outlining the 12 classes and mentioning that there's rather extensive character customization. There's one page explaining mags with so many in-game terms and charts that it was just sort of hypnotic to my younger self. It's so much shit that I did not understand, but it seemed cool and complicated and awesome. Then one page with a map and bits of strategy for the first area, and then one last page talking about the shops and items, along with more mention of online play. A lot of it is pretty simple because they are cramming a ton into 5 pages, but it captured my imagination as a kid, so must have been doing something right. And maybe it only seems simple because I'm the guy who spent over 2 years obsessing over not only the original PSO, but its various sequels. We have a few more ads and a rapid-fire preview section. I'll go over these a little more later. They don't really interest me that much. Oh, there's the sweepstakes thing that they had in every issue. Never actually got around to entering any of these. Then we have more Kirby. This time some quick tips for Nightmare in Dreamland. As I alluded to, this game is where I became a Kirby fan. Although I think I wanted the game before seeing this article, since I seem to recall TV commercials for it that got me interested. Even if I didn't know at the time it was a remake of Kirby's Adventure, I did kind of feel cheated when I brought Kirby's Adventure on Wii Virtual Console a few years later. I do have fond nostalgia for Nightmare in Dreamland. It's from that early point in my childhood where I didn't have a lot of games, so I played the ones I did have over and over again. So I like it, even if I now realize that it going back to the most basic version of Kirby's copy ability mechanics would maybe set the series back a bit until Superstar Ultra brought back the better, more complex copy ability mechanics. But you know, just looking at the screenshots, god damn, Kirby games on the GBA were fucking beautiful. Then there's an article on A Link to the Past GBA port. Another game I didn't know was a port/remake, but of course I didn't care. Because of this port, I got to grow up with one of the best games Nintendo has ever made, and I fell in love with the series thanks to this game. Like with sci-fi, I was already a budding fantasy nerd by this point in my life, so it was naturally captivating to me, and it spawned an obsession with the franchise. I was really lucky since within the next few years I would get to play nearly every game in the franchise up to that point. The only one that would have to wait a bit longer was Link's Awakening. And if you asked me from about 8 to 13 what my favorite game series was, I would always say Legend of Zelda. I even remember getting my parents' help to make my own Link costume for Halloween, and I'm still very nostalgic for classic Zelda. It even gave me a sword fixation that is with me to this day. And that's kind of all the stuff I really have much to say about. There's 2 more sections, one with brief half-page bits of info on games, none of which are really interesting to me, and the review section, where most of the reviews I care about are for games we have already talked about. And I'm a bit mixed on the reviews of this era. I like that they have ratings from most of the editors for each game and a summary of your genre preferences to help you figure out how to weigh their opinions, but I feel like the highlighted reviews barely have enough information, and even back in the day, the non-highlighted reviews crammed in 6 to a page always failed to grab my attention. Maybe having box art instead of these low-resolution screenshots would have helped these to catch my attention a bit more. Another Skies of Arcadia thing, this time a rather pretty full-page ad. And 2 more pages that maybe are worth a mention. The NP411 page with all the contact info is amusing to me looking back. I don't think I ever paid attention to it as a kid, I was probably too young, but it's funny to see, like, tip hotlines mentioned. I hadn't realized that they were still around when I started playing video games. I assumed they'd died out by the end of the 90s, but no, they at least lasted long enough to have this section in a magazine that I owned. Then there's also an ad for some Burger King toys. I have a Kirby top thing from this somewhere. I don't know where it got to, but I don't think I would have tossed in the last move. move. I do distinctly remember seeing it when sorting through some old stuff. It's probably in that box of random junk right next to my shelf. I should dig through that now that my space is more set up. Anyway, there are some other things in this issue that I didn't really have much to say about because I didn't want to break up the already awkward flow. There was a James Bond game, 007 Nightfire, that I think people my age are pretty nostalgic for these days. Resident Evil 0 was a game with a strategy article here, but I feel like it's one of the Resident Evil games no one really cares to remember. It's not even like hated like Code Veronica is, I just never see it mentioned. There was a section on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 4. You know, I'm shocked that growing up in the aughts I never played a skateboarding game until last year. There's a few cool previews like a Hunter the Reckoning game and Blood Omen 2. Plenty of stuff I'm sure means stuff to other people, but I just don't have much interest in then or now. Oh, and going by these scans, there were a couple of other things included, a preview DVD that I remember having and it sitting around for forever before my family finally got a DVD player and I could actually watch it. Okay, realistically it was probably like a year at most, but when that's more than 10% of your life, it feels like forever. And it also had an Animal Crossing e-reader card with a pattern based on the original Legend of Zelda. Honestly, these aren't important, but I felt like mentioning them. Anyway, this has kind of just been a fun ramble and a trip down memory lane. Honestly, this is kind of a weird case in that pretty much everything featured here that I was or am interested in is something I've played. There's not really a lot here that I can do more with. I would like for future videos to have me try a couple of games that are shown off that caught my eye then and now, but that I've never played before. And let me know what you think about this concept. It is, I do like that this whole idea is potentially much easier to produce, although I feel like my audio quality is going to be a bit lower until I get the exact production pipeline on this sorted. But yeah, what do you think? Do you want me to dive more into every little game shown? Do you want me to just cover the stuff that's heavily featured and not like talk about games in a half-page blurb or a single ad? I decided to cover anything and everything that I had something to say about because unless this series gets huge, it's likely I'll jump around a lot and may never do another issue from within like 3 months of this one. But I also really liked doing this one because this is an interesting time to go back and study. The sixth console generation was a transitional era for video games, fitting for the first console generation of the new millennium. Gaming was going from being more of kids stuff to being much more mainstream, though the transitional period it was in had them as somewhere between kids stuff and nerd shit. Gaming wouldn't really be cool and mainstream until the seventh generation with its two-pronged assault. Stuff like Halo, Gears of War, and Call of Duty were huge hits that made gaming normal and cool with high school and college-aged males, while the Wii would be a more earnest attempt at gaming for everyone that would get families and older folks to try video games for the first time. And you can kind of see that in the games of this era. The GameCube had a reputation as a kiddie console, but here we mostly see stuff outside of the usual core Nintendo properties and some licensed stuff aimed more at an adolescent male audience, as was the style at the time. So now is the part where I kick it back to you. What are your memories with any of the games covered in this issue? And if I do this again, what's an issue of Nintendo Power you might want me to cover? Unfortunately, as I mentioned, I was a Nintendo kid growing up, so even if some of my favorite games ever now are PS2 titles, like Devil May Cry and Metal Gear Solid, I can only really speak nostalgically about Nintendo Power. And normally I don't like to ask this, but if you'd like and subscribe and share the video, well, the better my metrics, the more likely I am to do this again. But anyway, this is Mikhail, signing off.